There is a particular sound that exists nowhere in the modern world, and yet remains instantly, viscerally recognizable to a specific group of people the moment it is described: the screeching. Layered static of a dial-up modem connecting to the internet. For anyone who did not live through it, the sound means nothing. For those who did, it triggers something close to a full sensory memory. The specific room they were sitting in, the particular anxiety of hoping no one would pick up the phone line. The strange thrill of waiting, sometimes for several minutes, simply to be granted access to a single web page. This is not ordinary nostalgia. It is something more specific, and it belongs almost exclusively to one generation, the one wedged quietly between two much louder cultural narratives. Generation X is typically defined as those born between 1965 and 1980, a cohort considerably smaller and culturally quieter than the baby boomers before them or the millennials after. They are sometimes called the latchkey generation, a reference to the literal house keys many of them wore around their necks as children. Let into empty homes after school while both parents worked, with no supervision, no scheduled activities, and no expectation that anyone would be checking in until dinner. This detail matters more than it might initially appear, because it points to something psychology takes seriously. The generational cohort effect, the well-documented phenomenon in which people who come of age during the same historical period, exposed to the same formative conditions at the same developmental stage, tend to develop measurably similar psychological tendencies as a result. Cohort effects are not personality destiny, and individual variation within any generation remains enormous. But shared historical conditions, experienced during the specific developmental windows when identity and worldview are still forming, leave a detectable imprint. For Generation X, that imprint was shaped by an unusually specific set of conditions. They were children during a period of rising divorce rates, increased dual-income households, and a cultural shift away from the highly structured, closely supervised childhood that had defined previous decades. They were by both circumstance and necessity given an enormous amount of unsupervised time, and unsupervised time, psychology consistently shows, tends to produce self-reliance. Because there is simply no one else present to solve the problem of an empty refrigerator, a broken bike chain, or an evening alone. This single condition explains why certain memories, coming home to an empty house, making your own dinner at age 9, riding a bike for hours with no method for anyone to locate you, carry a specific emotional charge for Gen X that younger generations, raised under closer supervision and constant digital contact with parents, simply do not share. These are not just memories of a different time. They are encoded, in psychological terms, with the heightened vividness of what researchers call flashbulb memory, the tendency for the brain to retain unusually sharp, detailed recollections of moments tied to significant personal or historical transition. And Generation X experienced an extraordinary concentration of transition, layered one on top of another, within a single formative period. They were old enough to remember a fully analog childhood, landline phones, physical photographs that took days to develop, television schedules dictating exactly when a show could be watched, and young enough to become fully functioning adults navigating the early internet, the rise of personal computing, and eventually the arrival of smartphones. No generation before or since has occupied quite this specific position. Not confused outsiders watching digital transformation happen to younger people, but active adults who built, adapted to, and helped construct the bridge between two entirely different technological worlds, in real time, within their own working lives. This combination of formative independence and lived technological transition appears to have shaped several recognizable psychological patterns that show up consistently in how this generation approaches adult life, work, and uncertainty. There is the pattern shaped directly by that early, unsupervised independence, a tendency towards self-reliance, comfort with solving problems alone, and a certain discomfort with excessive oversight or micromanagement, rooted in childhoods that simply never included either. There is the pattern shaped by having to repeatedly translate between two technological eras, a flexibility and adaptability earned not through theoretical openness to change, but through direct, repeated, lived practice at learning entirely new systems multiple times within a single working life. And there is a third pattern, quieter and more skeptical, shaped by a cultural moment defined by institutional disappointment and a particular brand of detached irony that became something close to a generational signature. These are not simply pleasant recollections of a bygone decade. They are, examined closely, evidence of specific psychological conditions that shaped how an entire generation learned to navigate independence, adaptation, and trust, lessons formed not through instruction, but through lived necessity during the exact years when those lessons mattered most. There is a specific kind of confidence that develops only one way, by being handed a genuine problem, alone, with no one available to solve it for you, and discovering afterward that you managed anyway. This is the foundation beneath the first psychological pattern worth examining closely, because it explains far more about adult behavior than the nostalgic memory itself ever suggests on the surface. The independent self-starter pattern traces directly back to those unsupervised after-school hours, and its effects extend well beyond simple self-sufficiency. Children who consistently solve small problems alone, a locked door, a minor injury, a disagreement with a sibling with no adult present to mediate, develop something psychologists refer to as internal locus of control, a deep-seated belief that outcomes depend primarily on one's own actions, rather than external intervention or rescue. This belief, formed early and reinforced repeatedly, tends to persist into adulthood as a recognizable professional and personal trait, comfort working without close supervision, a tendency to solve problems quietly before escalating them to anyone else, and a mild but persistent discomfort with environments that demand constant check-ins or approval. This is not detachment from others. It is a deeply internalized trust in one's own competence, built the only way that kind of trust can actually be built, through repeated, lived evidence rather than reassurance. The analog-to-digital translator pattern reveals something equally significant about adaptability under genuine pressure, rather than theoretical willingness to change. This is the generation that learned to use a card catalog and then, within the same decade, learned to navigate a search engine. That memorized phone numbers and then learned to manage a contact list. That developed photographs in a darkroom and then learned to edit digital images on a screen. Each of these transitions required something psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the capacity to abandon an entire learned system and rebuild competence in a new one, repeatedly, without the luxury of gradual, optional adoption. Younger generations frequently grew up already inside the digital system, never required to make this leap because there was no analog system to leave behind. Older generations often resisted the leap entirely, retiring before full adaptation became unavoidable. Generation X did the leap itself, multiple times in real time, while fully responsible for careers, families, and obligations that offered no grace period for the learning curve. The quiet skeptic pattern is perhaps the most psychologically distinct, formed during a specific cultural moment defined by a wave of institutional disappointment, political scandals, economic instability, and a media landscape that increasingly rewarded irony and detachment over sincerity. Coming of age during this period appears to have produced a generational tendency toward measured skepticism rather than either blind institutional trust or active rebellion against it. This skepticism, examined closely, is not cynicism for its own sake. It is a kind of earned caution, a learned tendency to verify before believing, to maintain independence of judgment rather than deferring automatically to authority, and to treat grand promises with appropriate suspicion until evidence arrives. Sociological and workplace research on generational cohorts offers genuine, if appropriately qualified, support for these patterns. Studies on workplace behavior have repeatedly identified Generation X employees as disproportionately comfortable with autonomous work, adaptable across technological transitions, and pragmatic rather than idealistic in their professional expectations. It is worth stating clearly that generational research describes tendencies and averages across large populations. Not fixed rules governing every individual. There is enormous variation within any generation. And these patterns should be understood as meaningful trends, rather than universal truths applied to any single person. There is also something worth naming honestly about Generation X's position in broader cultural conversation. They are frequently overlooked, sandwiched between the much larger, more culturally dominant baby boomer and millennial generations, rarely receiving the sustained attention either of those cohorts commands in media, marketing, or public discourse. And yet the foundational adaptive traits this generation developed, independence formed through necessity, flexibility formed through repeated technological transition, skepticism formed through earned experience, represent precisely the qualities most frequently identified as essential for navigating an increasingly uncertain and rapidly changing world. This is, in the end, the most important reframe available here. These specific memories, the dial-up modem, the unsupervised afternoons, the landline phone bolted to a kitchen wall, are not simply sentimental artifacts of a particular decade. They are lived proof that a generation forced to navigate uncertainty, repeated change, and the absence of constant support did not merely survive that experience. They built from it a durable and transferable form of psychological resilience. This lesson does not belong exclusively to Generation X. Anyone at any age, currently moving through their own period of unfamiliar change, unsupervised responsibility, or institutional disappointment is undergoing precisely the same formative process, whether or not it ever produces a generational label of its own. Before this video ends, if you belong to Generation X, consider this. Which specific memory from your own formative years, a moment of unsupervised problem solving, an early experience of adapting to something entirely new, do you now recognize as the true origin of a strength you still carry today? And if you belong to a different generation entirely, what current transition in your own life might one day be remembered the same way, not simply as a difficult period to survive, but as the exact moment your own resilience was quietly built?